Right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I am with my handy-dandy laptop this morning because I didn't print out before I left my hotel room this morning. So bear with me here as I use this. So yes, please join us in Charlotte. We're going to have a phenomenal time. And some of the material that I'm going to cover today dealing with the Exodus, today we're going to be into the particulars of the Exodus itself. When we're in Charlotte, we're going to do an overview and deal more with the archaeological evidence, with more of the historical Exodus that Scripture supports, as well as a lot of ancient authors. So we're going to get more into that in Charlotte. Here we're going to stick more with the biblical narrative and see what it supports and see what the history supports. So one thing that we find in the Parsha today, or with the Passover story, is we see this pattern, this idea of circumcision, this physical circumcision, this Passover, which would have been a self-imprecating act. And let me just define this really quick, because a lot of the material that we'll deal with today, we'll get into it. A self-imprecating oath would have been an oath you would have taken as part of a ritual meal, as part of a sacrifice, where you would slay an animal, and as you slayed that animal, you would take an oath and say, if I do not abide by this covenant, by this treaty, if I do not uphold this compact, then what happens to this animal will happen to me and my descendants. So this was a curse almost that you took, that if you did not obey, then you acknowledge that this would be the consequence. There would be this holocaust of the animal for you and your children if you did not uphold it. So you would take this covenant. But then what we see with Passover, and what we're going to see today, not only in the law, but also in the words of the prophets, is this idea of Passover and recovenanting, Passover and recovenanting. So throughout Israel's history, we find that when the Passover was kept, there was always this time of recovenanting. And then what happened after that? Well, the prophets talk about this time of restoration. So now today, before we get into a lot of that, I really want to get into the historical background of the Exodus. And to me, this is really what gives it life, it's what makes the story real, is when we can take it out of not just the pages of Scripture, but we can say, wow, this is what was happening in history at the time, and this is what was going on in the background. Because, one of the things that Israel scribes did, it didn't matter if it was during the Judges era, it didn't matter if it was in the monarchy era. They only recorded information as it pertained to Israel, or as Israel interacted with the nations. So, for instance, if Israel was confederate with Syria and there was an invasion by Tiglath-Pileser, or say Shalmaneser, to Syria, and it involved, say, for instance, Ahab, but it wasn't a direct confrontation to Israel, it was written from an Israelite perspective, and the only information we have is of Syria. We don't get the rest of the story. Israel's scribes really weren't interested in the rest of the story as we are today. So their view is much more limited in that they just are worried about the contact with Israel itself. So here's the background of the historical Exodus. We find that, and if you will remember the last time that we talked on the Joseph saga, that under his administration there was this massive centralization of government under Joseph. Probably the centralization took place within 7 to 14 years. Granaries and store cities were erected to withstand the time of famine, and the entire land became Pharaoh's. It says that Joseph bought the entire land of Egypt. We also find in Genesis 47:11 this reference within the Joseph story to Ramesses. It says that in Genesis 47:11, it says, and the property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Now, this reference to district of Ramesses, no scholar, not even those that support the most minimalistic views, equate Joseph with Ramses. So here we have a reference to Ramses that is out of date. It's anachronistic. Now, some people will say that this compromises the validity of the scriptural text. I have another theory that I think is very much in view and in line with what we find happens in Israel's history writing over the ages. And that is that all that this reveals, this reference to Ramesses, is the date and the era in which this particular archive was updated, it was transcribed, and it was written into a new parchment, a new scroll, and it was transmitted to a new generation. So what do you do if I'm writing history today and I'm writing it for my children, I'm writing it for colleagues, I'm writing it for the public to consume? I am going to be writing in a very contemporary setting. I might refer to Putin, I might refer to Obama, I might refer to other things that are kind of iconic of our day. We find the same thing in this Genesis 47 text where these scribes used landmarks, they used people with whom their reader could identify with. And they could identify with Ramses because they were living at the time of Ramses. So what we find is that this gloss occurred during the administration of Deborah, who would have been contemporary with Ramses, and she would, and her scribes would have done a lot of archiving during that time period and updating the nation's archives. But it's also interesting because when we find out that Deborah was contemporary with Ramses, we realize there's a whole lot of Israel's history, the Judges era, the Exodus, the wilderness sojourn, all of this that precedes it. So we're going way back in time, and we're going a lot earlier in time than previously conceived. Now, the other thing that we found in the Joseph story was that when Pharaoh elevated Joseph and his brothers came into Egypt, Pharaoh, this is Genesis 47:6, he says, "If you know of any men of activity among your brethren, make them rulers over my cattle." So we find that the Hebrews became the official shepherding office of the crown. They were the administrators of Egypt's, they were kind of like the cattle ranchers of Egypt's realm. Now, what's interesting, most scholars see that Joseph rose to power in Egyptian's 12th dynasty. These would have been very strong Egyptian kings. Again, they had very centralized governments, system of government, and it would be under this system that Joseph would have risen to power. Now, what's interesting when we get into Exodus, and we begin in Exodus 1 with the background of the story of the Exodus. Exodus 1 verse 6 says, "And Joseph died and all his brethren and all of that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and they increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled of them. Then there arose a new king who knew not Joseph, and he came to power in Egypt." Now, this idea of a new king arising in power who knew not Joseph, if we're talking typical Egyptian dynasties, that's unheard of. It is impossible for a king to rise to power and not know Joseph, and let me tell you why. There was one thing that Egypt worshipped as much as they worshipped their gods, and that was their history. Egypt loved their history. They preserved their history. If a usurping king came to the throne, unlike other nations where they would destroy any reference, say like ISIS does today, just go around destroying any reference or any memory of the past, even if you usurped the throne, you still preserved another king's memory. That was like righteousness in their eyes, was to preserve a predecessor's memory. It wasn't just the kings that were immortalized. You had high people, nobles in the realm that were also immortalized. And it was through their history. You had tombs. As a vizier, Joseph would have had a tomb. So their history would have been very, very much ingrained within the Egyptian culture. Now, the only way that a king could come to power who knew not Joseph is if this were a king that really had very limited knowledge of Egyptian history itself. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because what we find out happens at this time, is that the famines under Joseph, we find that Joseph's brothers came to Egypt, but you know what? They really weren't alone. Almost the whole interior of Canaan, because of the famine, migrates into Egypt. And this time becomes known as the Second Intermediate Period, because when you have massive waves of immigration, your local infrastructure starts breaking down. There's only so much immigration that your governmental systems, that your existing population, supply, trains, and all that can handle. So as this more demand takes place, what happens? These people, these foreigners, begin gaining power, offices of power in the government. They begin rising through the ranks. And within a very, very short period of time, as short as perhaps 1 or 2 generations, maybe at the most 3, we find that these people, which the Egyptians called Amu, they're really, the term is more Asiatics, Amorites, or Canaanites, they overthrow Egypt's government. And this is where we find this Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. And now Manetho was a 3rd century Egyptian priest. He wrote a lot of Egyptian history, and he's known to us today through fragments that exist in later historians' writings, whether it's Josephus, Clement, or some of these other historians. Unfortunately, the book that he wrote, it was called Egyptic, I believe it's Egyptica. It has since, it was probably burned at the Library of Alexandria. For those of you that brings tears to your eyes. We don't know what was lost there. But what we find is that these, Manetho called them Hyksos, which just means foreign ruler, and they were shepherd kings, but they were not shepherd kings. They were really these foreign rulers. And they came and they overthrew Egyptians' 12th, 13th dynasty. So you had your traditional kings of Egypt had to retreat southward, and these foreigners took and they began to place people under oppression. So we always think of the Egyptians, we always think that of the Exodus as the Egyptians oppressing the Israelites. And the story as we know it, it may not have been the Egyptians. It might have been these foreign invaders that come into the land, and then they oppress Israel within Egypt. And as we're going to see, Isaiah lends support to this idea. Now, this is what Josephus tells us, and Josephus is quoting from Manetho. He says, "By main force the Hyksos easily seized Egypt without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly." Again, this is from Manetho's perspective. "They razed to the ground the temples and gods. Finally, they appointed a king of their own number, whose name was Salatius. He had his seat of government at Memphis, levying tribute from Upper and Lower Egypt, and always leaving garrisons behind in the most advantageous positions." But what's very interesting when we read the story of the Exodus, at the time that Israel actually walks out of Egypt on the 15th of Aviv, it says that Israel left Israel with their garrisoned forces. This would have been an armed fighting units by which they would have left Egypt. That really makes no sense in the Ramesside times or in later times, but it makes perfect sense at this point in time when garrisoned forces were very much active and very much employed during the Second Intermediate Period. Now, Isaiah tells us, and this is going to be Isaiah 52, verse 4, he gives us an interesting perspective on the people that oppressed Israel. And this is what he says. He says, "For thus says Yahweh Elohim, my people went aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause." Now, again, what do we have Assyrians doing in Egypt? This is really unheard of. Well, when you look at the migrations of the people from the land of Assyria, from the land of Mesopotamia, through Canaan and then into Egypt, this is probably the perspective that Isaiah had. They would have been Amorites that had grown powerful and oppressed the local population. Now, this is very interesting, too, in light of the Promised Land Covenant, the Promised Land Covenant, which we're going to get into here in just a minute. The other thing that we find that these usurpers did, and Egypt had a history of doing this as well, but it was kind of like the Asiatics did this on steroids. They put Israel under corvée labor, and we want to think of this as slavery. This is not plantation slavery as we think of it today. The oppression during the Exodus would have been an oppression of labor. You had to give a certain amount of your labor to Pharaoh. Corvée labor, which was also used by Solomon, required that this forced compulsory servitude, you still had wealth. You still had, at least in Israel, you would have had a private property, but you had this term of service that you had to serve the Pharaoh. But you still had cattle, flocks, herds, other forms of wealth and possessions that when we think of slavery, in more modern terms, slaveries did not have. So let's read Exodus 11, 11 through 14. It says, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now, again, remember, this is written during, I'm sorry, this is 1:11 and 12. If this archive is being updated by Deborah Scribes, she's using the reference to Ramses, but probably referring to the earlier city, which was underneath it by the more modern term. It says, but the more they oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians became to dread the Israelites, and they worked them ruthlessly. And they made their lives bitter with hard labor and brick and mortar of all kinds of work in the fields. In their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. So we find that this centralized government that Joseph had employed, and then these usurpers later took over, that it was this centralized form of government that really enabled Egypt to oppress the Israelites and to bring them under servitude. In some ways, I often look at us today and I say, how much better are we off? I mean, we are incredibly better off. But you look at the taxation, the ever-burning taxation that we have to pay, the ever-burning demands of our time, whether it's through community service or all these different things that we do today, and you can kind of see some parallels there to this type of demand that is given of our time and of our families. Now, Scripture and Josephus are not the only documents that we have to witness this oppression. There is an Egyptian document that was written by a scribe during the New Kingdom era, but historians recognize this, or Egyptologists recognize this document as dating to much earlier in time, and this is called the Admissions of Ippur. And this is basically a scribe's admonitions or encouragements, words of wisdom to the king to preserve law and order and to reign righteously within the Egyptian kingdom. But this is what he gives. He says, this is what happened before us. And he's referring to the second intermediate period at the time of Moses' birth. And he says, this is what happened before. Don't let it happen again. But this is what he says. He says, lo, citizens were put to the grindstones. Wearers of fine linen are beaten with sticks. The tomb builders have become field laborers. Those who were in the God's barn are now yoked to it. So what we find is this reversal of fortune about the time of this, and what we'll see here in a minute is that it occurred about the time of Moses' birth, where these usurpers in Egypt come in and they overthrow the traditional Egyptian monarch, and they, just like with the French Revolution, the nobility, the noble class is all of a sudden finds itself in rags and ashes, and they are made the slaves of the realm as the invaders and the foreigners then, according to Torah, to use Torah terminology, become high above you, and the native of the land becomes very low. Now, Josephus elaborates on this further. Again, he's quoting to Manetho, and the reference is to Dudimose. Now, Dudimose was a king during the second intermediate period. And Josephus, again quoting Manetho, says, in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from regions of the east, invaders of an obscure race marched in confidence and victory against our land. By main force, they easily overpowered the rulers of the land, and they burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, treated the natives with cruelty and hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. This is kind of the basic thing that Exodus 1 is telling us. Finally, they appointed a king of their own number. His name was Salatus, and he had his seat in Memphis, levying tribute from Upper and Lower Egypt and leaving garrisons behind. Now, he also tells us that they called their capital of their city Avarez, out of some sort of religious tradition. And this kind of brings us into the religion of these invaders of Egypt. Throughout Israel's history, once they come into the promised land, we find that the one thing they were always plagued with was this Baal worship, this idolatry to Baal. It seemed like you could never get Israel separated from this Baal doctrine. And what we find is that they really took hold of this Baal doctrine when they were in Egypt, because the one thing that these invaders brought with them, the one doctrine that these invaders brought with them in Egypt was this worship of Baal. And in Egypt, they worshipped the god Seth. And in Egyptian theology, Seth was the evil god. He was the one that had killed Osiris, the god's son, who was later died and was resurrected. But they took this Seth god and they worshipped him as Baal. So he was known as Seth Baal. But what's very interesting when we go into Egypt's later history is that many of the prophets, whether it's Samuel or Ezekiel or Joshua, tell us that when Israel was in Egypt, that they worshipped Egypt's gods. Turn with me to Joshua 24:14. Joshua says, "Now therefore fear Yahweh and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on this side of the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve Jehovah." So the idea that Israel served gods in Egypt, and Joshua is admonishing them to put away those gods. Again, we have in Ezekiel 20, verses 6 and 7, Ezekiel says, "And that in the day that I lifted up my hand to them to bring them forth out of Egypt, a land that I had seen for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. Then I said to them, cast you away, every man, the abomination of your eyes. Defile not yourselves with the idols of Egypt, for I am Yahweh your God." So there's this idea that when Israel was coming out of the land of Egypt, not only were they being redeemed from the land itself, but they were being redeemed from all of this idolatrous doctrine. So we see that this exodus from Egypt was an exodus from Egypt's theology. They kind of went hand in hand. You didn't really have this physical exodus without this spiritual exodus that accompanied it. 2 Samuel 7:23, we kind of see the same thing there as well. And Samuel says, "And what one nation in the earth is like unto your people, even Israel, whom God went to redeem for a people for himself, and to make him a name, and to do for your great things and terrible, for your land that is before your people, and the redeemed, who redeemed you from Egypt, and from the nation's gods." So we have this idea that not only has Israel been redeemed from the land of Egypt, Israel has been redeemed from the gods of Egypt. And I find it very, very likely, in the book of Judges, we find that Israel goes into idolatry. They rebel against Yahweh. And what does he do? He places them under oppression. They learn their lesson. They come back to Yahweh. He relieves their oppression. They rebel. They go into oppression. They come back to him. They're relieved from oppression. So we see this cycle over and over again. So it's very likely that this idolatry in Egypt preceded Israel's oppression by the Hyksos, by the Asiatics there in Egypt. So, and when we look at us today, how much different is that from us today? Because so many of us have found ourselves in what we would term idolatrous ideas. So we find that this pre-redemption era is, you find a redeeming from the gods of the land. Now, we're going to come back to Exodus and the story of Moses' birth. So if you'll come back with me now to Exodus 1:15, it says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, and if it is a boy, kill him, and if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared Jehovah and would not do what the king told him to do, and they let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" And the midwives answered Pharaoh, "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased, even more numerous. And because of the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Now, this reference here to families of their own, a few verses later, it says he made for them houses. This is the exact same covenant Yahweh would later make with Phinehas and with David. They're called covenants of light, in that these people, and then in these cases, 2 women are promised to always have seed on the land. Their seed will be an eternal seed. It will never be put out. So it's this covenant of light that they will always have children. But then in verse 22, here, this becomes key. It says, Pharaoh gave his order to all people: every boy that is born among you must be thrown into the river Nile, but let every girl live. Now, the admonitions of Ipur, we find a very similar story. It says, lo, the children of nobles are dashed against the walls. The infants are put on high ground. Lo, the children of nobles are dashed against the walls. And he repeats it again. The infants are put on high ground. Lo, terror kills. Lo, women are barren and none conceive. So we find that this is a very, very tumultuous time in history where women don't want to conceive, because if they bear children, they're just going to be born to death. And this is kind of the background that we see. Aaron's birth was not an issue. He was born. There was no threat on his life. But within 3 years of Moses' birth, this occurs. And then, of course, we have the idea of where Josephus, quoting Manetho, says that they were massacred during this time. So at the time of this revolution, we find comes full circle. The Hyksos have come to power during Moses' lifetime. Moses is exiled for killing the Egyptian. And at the time of the Exodus, we find that Israel still has very friendly relations with the traditional Egyptian kings. And how do we know this? Kamose, which would have been the king of the south, says that he and his rulers are very, very happy with the situation of their herds and cattle pasturing in the north and being tended to by the shepherds. Well, if they had retained friendly relations, these were probably Hebrews that were pasturing the kings of the south's cattle. And it was the reason why they weren't just real eager to go to war. But at the time of the Exodus, we find Egypt is not unified. Egypt is fractured. There's this northern king who would have been Assyrian, Asiatic, that under whom Israel would have served. And then there's this southern king who would have really have been the legitimate Egyptian monarch. Now, it's very interesting because Yahweh says that regarding the Pharaoh of the Exodus, he says, I have raised you up that I may make my name known. And we discover something very interesting about this particular Pharaoh of the Exodus. And that is that this guy had a lot of pride and a lot of gall. He writes this inflammatory letter to the king of the south, Kamose. And he tells him that he can't sleep at night because his hippopotamuses, which are 200 miles south, are braying so loudly that they're keeping him up at night. So, and of course, when Kamose, the king of the Theban king in the south, gets this letter, he's going, what do we make of this? This is a lunatic. There's no way. But it was trying to provoke a confrontation for war. He was trying to insult him. But what else this king does, and the king of the north, his name was Apophis, what he does is very interesting. He challenges all the gods of Egypt to a duel. And this is what he says. He says, so we shall see the power of God, of whose God is with him as protector. He who relies on his God, who is in the land, except Amun-Re, the king of the gods. So it's kind of ancient text, and in the text itself is a little fragmented. But what Apophis is doing is he is challenging the gods of Egypt to a duel. And he is saying, my God is the only God, and all these other gods of Egypt, they're nothing. You can't beat my God. Well, from what we know of history, it looks like Apophis came out for the better, because the kings of the south, some of their corpses show really a lot of damage, a lot of bodily mutilation. So we are pretty confident that though the war did not fare so well for the Theban kings, but that was very short-lived because Yahweh answered this challenge. And how did he answer this challenge of the gods to this arrogant? This king was so arrogant that the king of the south called Apophis a brave ass, just as kind of a pejorative term. So when Yahweh says, and this is Exodus 9, 16, and 17, he says, behold, I have raised you up that I may show in you my power and that my name may be declared on all the earth. I mean, I don't think we can appreciate exactly how arrogant this king was and how sure and confident he was of him and his god Seth until we go through this Exodus story and we see time and time again a plague comes and he hardens his heart. A plague comes and he hardens his heart. So he really had this ongoing, I guess I'd call it a self-righteousness, but it was a righteousness that wasn't built on anything that was solid. It was built on a lot of pagan theology. Now, another thing that is often viewed as a source criticism and a detriment to the Hebrew text is that with the release of the Hebrew slaves, we have in Exodus 12:30 where in one case you have, and they refer to it as the schizophrenic Pharaoh. In one case you have Pharaoh who releases the Hebrew slaves, and then all of a sudden he forgets that he releases them. It's told unto Pharaoh. So the question there is, what's going on? Did Pharaoh release them or did he? Well, and I think the problem that we have when we read the text is more on our end, because if you take into consideration that there are two different pharaohs of the Exodus, the Assyrian or the Asiatic in the north, and then the Theban in the south. At the time of the Exodus, this king of the south is encroaching. He is waging war, and city after city has fallen to him shortly before the Exodus. So when Yahweh says, I will not take him by the way of the Philistines because they shall see war, right before the Exodus, when we go with the dating system, within about a month before the Exodus, Tajaru, which would have been that frontier city on that route, had just fallen to Camosi. So he literally could not take them through that way because there would have been war. So by taking him around the southern Sinai Peninsula, it enabled a route for escape. But then it says, but then it was told to Pharaoh, they have gone. This is very likely, and Simcha also makes this point, that it is very likely it was told to a different Pharaoh. We find very unusual that unexplainedly, we have no reason for it, Apophis, who was this arrogant king, and Camosi, the king of the south, die within probably a couple months of each other, perhaps at the same time. From what we know, they would have been both firstborn sons, but we don't know why they died right at the same time. Camosi's younger brother, Amosi, comes to the rescue. He ends up chasing the Hyksos out of Egypt later on, probably maybe about 15, 20 years after Israel had already left Egypt. But he has written what is called the Storm Stela. And in my book, I discuss this because it's really too detailed to go into here. But there are many things in this Storm Stela that coincide with the plagues. There's days of darkness, there's flooding. And what's interesting is that it is with the destruction of flax that Yahweh says, behold, it will be on your very heart. Well, this exact same terminology is used in the Storm Stela. And we find that many of these plagues touch Egyptians to their very heart, like it hit them so very hard to the very core. And but when we look at this, and it is very interesting because what we find is that even though Israel was in Egypt, we find that they are worshiping other gods. We find that Yahweh's allowed them to come under oppression, probably because they've departed from him and his ways. But even when they're in Egypt and they're in servitude and in bondage and there's this impending war, he doesn't forget them. He remembers them. So the question is why? Why does God remember them? And why does he choose to reestablish a covenant with them? So, and this is, we're going to look now at what is called the circumcision covenant. And this is the most revolutionary covenant in many respects that was ever made with the nation of Israel or the patriarchs. So turn, if you will, with me to Genesis 17:7. He says, and I will make with you, and this is Yahweh talking to Abraham, exceedingly fruitful. And I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and your seed after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be your God, to be a God to you and to your seed after you. Think about that for a minute. Your seed in their generations for an everlasting covenant. This means every new generation of Abraham. The covenant is offered to every new generation to Abraham. Said, I will give it to you and your seed after you, a land wherein you were a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. I will be their God. Yahweh has made a commitment. There are no restrictions on this other than that Israel uphold the previous stipulations of the previous covenants. But if there is a generation that cries out to him to be their God, as a righteous God, Yahweh must respond. We find in Exodus 1 and 2, what did the children of Israel do? It says their oppression was hard upon them, and they cried out to Yahweh. They cried out to Jehovah for deliverance. So we find that because he has committed himself to be the nation's God, to make this everlasting covenant with successive generations, he has to honor his covenant, and he has to offer it in perpetuity. Now, most covenants, again, as I mentioned before, were made with the self-imprecating oath. The circumcision covenant is different in that there is not a self-imprecating oath that accompanies it. Rather, it is the act of circumcision itself. And Yahweh says that it is that act of circumcision that seals that covenant. And as we'll see in just a minute, if you're not circumcised, you are not recognized as a member of the children of Israel. So it's this sign that you give in your flesh of being in compliance with the Creator's covenant. Now, Jeremiah builds on this idea, and he builds on this idea of the circumcision covenant and the recovenanting. And we're going to look at Jeremiah 34, 18, and 20. And this is what he says. He says, I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, which have not performed the words of the covenant which they had made with me before, when they passed through and the calf cut in twain, and they passed between the parts. Now, what Jeremiah here is referring to, in Zedekiah's day, the rulers of Judah, in an attempt to recovenant, to reestablish the covenant, and to do what is right in Yahweh's eyes, sought to observe the release year. And every release year, every 7 years, you would release your Hebrew slaves. So they took a covenant. They took an oath to uphold this. And what happened within a matter of a few weeks or a few months, the rulers of the city reneged on the deal. So Jeremiah goes on to prophesy against them, and he says that I will even take them from their land and give them into the hand of their enemies because they reneged on this deal. These rulers made a self-imprecating oath. They had a divided sacrifice, and very similar to Genesis 15, where Yahweh passes between the divided sacrifice and he burns it up. It's the self-imprecating oath of agreeing to do something. And in self-imprecating oaths, you agree to the terms and conditions, and if you violate it again, then you are given as kind of this Holocaust. You agree that these stipulations, if you violate, you will pay the price of not upholding it. But it's very interesting with the circumcision covenant, because that is not, the self-imprecating oath is not what is required. Rather, it is a sign in the flesh between you and God to circumcise your flesh, to be in compliance. Now, it's very interesting, the stipulations with the circumcision covenant, because we're going to find that these are the same stipulations that are upheld in the Passover covenant. And in Genesis 17, verse 12, it says, He that is 8 days among you shall be circumcised among you. Every man-child in your generations, he that is born in your house or bought with money of any stranger which is not your seed. So we find that he that is born within your house or bought with money must needs to be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But we find that strangers are prohibited, but if you are bought with money, if you are circumcised, then you can partake. Now we're going to find that this is very, very similar to the Passover celebrations, and the stipulations are very much the same. So why is it that with this exodus out of Egypt, with this history, why is Israel given this Passover meal that they are told to partake on? And why are they covenanting with God through this meal? And again, we find that Passover is a self-imprecating meal where Israel eats of it, and they bound themselves to the stipulations of the covenant. Now, we also find in Israel's history this idea of Passover and covenant renewal. So we have people renew the covenant and they observe the Passover. So they're very, very much tied together. Turn, if you will, with me to 2 Kings 23, verses 1 through 3. It says, "And the king sent, and they gathered unto him all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. And the king went up out of the house of Yahweh, and all the men of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, the priests and the prophets, and the people, both great and small. And he read in the ears the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of Yahweh. And the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before Yahweh, to walk after Yahweh, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and statutes with all their heart and soul, and perform the words of this covenants that are written in the book. And the people stood to the covenant." So we find that during Josiah's days, when the people stand to the covenant, it's like, taking a poll. Will you agree? And everybody raises their hands and they say, aye, I will. So we find that the people recovenanted. But what happens right next? We find still in verse 23, go down to verse 21, it says, "And the king commanded the people, saying, Keep the Passover unto Yahweh your God. It is written in the book of the covenant. Surely there was not held such a Passover from the days of judges that judged Israel, nor all the days of the kings of Israel, nor the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, wherein the Passover was held unto Yahweh." So we find that Josiah was very zealous in keeping the Passover. We find that the same thing happens in Hezekiah's day. If you go to 2 Chronicles 29:10, Hezekiah says, "Now it's in my heart to make a covenant with the God of Israel, that his fierce wrath may be turned away." So what does Hezekiah do? Hezekiah recovenants. And then we find a few months later that Hezekiah observes the Passover. So again, we have this idea of covenanting Passover. So let's compare now the stipulations of the circumcision covenant with the stipulations of Passover itself. If we go to Exodus 12, 43. It says, "Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. There shall no stranger eat thereof, but every man's servant that is bought with money. When he has circumcised him, he shall eat of it. And the foreign and a hired servant shall not eat of it." The stipulations for the Passover are the same stipulations for the circumcision covenant. So why are these stipulations important? When Israel entered the self-imprecating oath, their actions as a nation were judged. They were held accountable. So if the nation prevailed in righteousness, they received the covenant's blessings. If the nation declined from it, they rebelled against it, then they received all the curses in the law. If you read through Deuteronomy 28, Deuteronomy 29, these are not pleasant things. War is foretold. You will run at the sound of a shaking leaf. Your life will hang before you day and night. Illness, a disease of long continuance. All of these things are very specific curses that Israel would, that their imprecation would bear if they declined in it. The foreigner who is excluded, these were the Nakars, the people of the Canaanite, the Assyrian. They hadn't made this commitment to Yahweh. They had not taken this imprecating oath to take in the blessing and the curses. Their actions should not bear on Israel, and they should not be taken into consideration when Yahovah's judgment of Israel is considered. So the foreigner is excluded. But the ger, if the ger wants to convert, if he wants to assimilate into Israel, then guess what? What does he have to do? The one requirement is that he has to take the self-imprecating oath. Eat of this lamb in the self-imprecation and say that, if I do not uphold the words of the covenant, then I acknowledge that these curses of the covenant will come upon me. So, you don't ever sign a contract really without knowing for sure what's in it, blessings and curses. And we find that Yahweh wants you very much to be aware of what's in it. He gave it to Israel in a written contract. He said it was in a testimony that was held within the Ark of the Covenant. So, and it's very interesting too, that you cannot partake in one covenant, say the Passover covenant or the circumcision covenant, without taking part in all previous covenants. So if you take a part in the Passover, notice you're also taking part in the circumcision covenant. Because what do you have to do for Passover? You have to be circumcised. So if you're taking part in the Passover covenant, you're taking part in the circumcision covenant, because they're very much the same. So we find that Yahweh brings Israel out of Egypt. He says, you shall keep Yahweh's Passover. Your males shall be circumcised. You shall come near to keep it. And then in Exodus 12:49 it says, one law shall be to him that is homeborn, another to the stranger that dwells among you. So we find that Yahweh freely allowed people from other nations to come and partake and to join in. But again, it was that Passover meal that was the requirement. So now, as we look at this, Yahweh states that Israel is his firstborn. And Ross is very good at pointing out that it was the Passover that saved Yahweh's firstborn son. But my question is why? How did Passover save Yahweh's firstborn son? And today, when we're eating the Passover, we're not just observing a memorial, a remembrance. When we are eating Passover, it is an act of recovenanting. It is an act of recommitting to obey and of self-imprecation to say that if I do not uphold, I will bear the consequences. What we find is that when Israel does this, when Israel is willing to do this, when her heart has been willing to do this, that Yahweh responds the same way he did in Exodus with deliverance. When Israel returns to the covenant, when they're willing to recovenant, when they're willing to say, hey, I will put my life on the line for this and bear if I don't do it, that is when Yahweh stands to deliver. Now, the Sinai Covenant, the testimony, this would have been the legal contract that said these are the breaches for my covenant. Now, remember, before we look at this real quick, remember what Yahweh promised in the circumcision covenant? Remember, he says, I will establish my covenant between me and your seed after you in your generations. The only requirement was that they were in compliance, that they were obedient. And the Sinai Covenant gives us a law of prophecy. It gives us a chronological outline of Israel's consequences. And towards the very end, this is what it says. If you'll turn with me to Leviticus 26, verses 43. It says, and the land shall be left to them. This is talking about the very long diaspora. And shall enjoy her Sabbaths while she lies desolate without them. They shall accept the punishment of their iniquity because they despise my judgments and because their soul abhorred my statutes. And yet for all that, when they be in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away nor abhor them to destroy them utterly. I will to break my covenant with them. I am Yahweh their God. But I will for their sakes remember the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the sight of the heathen, that I may be a God to them. So this is like a fulfilling of the circumcision covenant. We return to Yahovah, and guess what? He returns to us. I mean, this is very much shows his righteousness in that he does not pass over us and forget us, but he passes over to save and to redeem. Deuteronomy 28 Deuteronomy 28 through 30 served as the definition, the prophetic law that defined Yahweh's judgments in a very chronological order if Israel should rebel. And this was the Deuteronomy covenant. And we find that Deuteronomy 30 occurs after the second temple remnant has rebelled, after Israel has been cast off and Yahweh has hidden his face for 2,000 years. And notice what it says in Deuteronomy 30. And by the way, the more of the scholarship behind this is in my book. I'm not getting it in today just because of time, but I do show and build a whole lot more on it there. But notice what Deuteronomy 30 says. And remember, this is part of the law. This is Yahweh's word to us. This is law. It cannot be changed. It says, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, you will call them to mind among the nations where Yahweh has driven you. And you shall return to Yahweh and obey. Again, you shall obey his voice according to all that I command you, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul. So how do we return to him? With all our heart and all our soul. Yahweh will turn your captivity and have compassion on you, and he will return and gather you from all nations, whether he has scattered you. If you be driven to the utmost parts of heavens, from there will Yahweh your God gather you, and from there will he fetch you. And Yahweh will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you will possess it. He will do you good and multiply you above your fathers. And Yahweh will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Yahovah with all your heart and all your soul, that you may live. And he'll take these curses and put them on your enemies. So notice that it is this coming and returning to Yahovah again after we've been dispersed from the land, that when we return to him, that that our heart is circumcised to him. Deuteronomy really establishes this idea of a second Exodus, of this time when we return to him, we search for him with all our heart and all our soul, and this act of recovenanting with him that allows Yahweh then to return to us and to recovenant with us and to again restore us to the land. Isaiah 11 builds on this, and if you look at Isaiah 11, 11 through 14, says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that Yahweh shall set his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left, from Assyria and from Egypt and Pathros and Cush and Elam, from Shinar and Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The envy of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. But they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Egyptians towards the west. They shall spoil them of the east together. They shall lay their hand on Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them." So what we find is this idea, again, the curse is being placed on the enemies, Yahweh restoring Israel. Jeremiah 29 says the same thing. This is Jeremiah 29, verse 12. "Then you will call upon me and come and pray, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all your heart." And then in Jeremiah 32, verse 37, he says, "Behold, I will gather them out of all countries, whither I have driven them in my anger and in my fury and with my great wrath, to bring them again to this place, to cause them to dwell safely. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God." Again, he is acknowledging this stipulation in the circumcision covenant to be their God to them again. He says, "And I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever. And I will do them good, and to their children after them. And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, and I will not turn away from them to do them good, but I will put my fear in their hearts, and they shall not depart from me. And I will rejoice over them to do good, and I will plant them on this land surely with my whole heart and my whole soul." Now remember, what did Deuteronomy 30, verse 2 said? He says, "When you search for me with all your heart and with all your soul," then Yahweh responds with his whole heart and with his whole soul to establish the covenant. We find Jeremiah builds on this idea of recircumcising your hearts and of restoration. And I know I'm going through a lot of text, but I just wanted to show you, go back and look at these on your own and research this for yourself, study it, see how consistent this is. In Jeremiah 4, verse 4, it says, "Circumcise yourself to Yahweh. Take away the foreskins of your heart, your men of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my fury break forth like fire, that none can quench it because of your evil doings." So we find that circumcising of the foreskins symbolizes something greater that will occur in the Deuteronomic restoration, where there is this circumcision of the heart to obey. And Jeremiah continues to build on this. And he says that this is Jeremiah 16, verse 10. He says, "It shall come to pass that Yahweh shall show this people all the words, and they shall say to you, why has Yahweh pronounced this great evil against us? And what is our iniquity? Or what is the sin that we have committed against our God?" When I think of Israel and Egypt, they must have said, why is our iniquity? Is our iniquity this great, that our children are slaughtered before our eyes, that we are in oppression, that we are in this incredibly horrible situation. Is our iniquity so great to merit this? And Jeremiah says that we'll come to this point where we will say, what is our sin? Is our sin this great to merit all of these curses, all these things that have come upon us? But notice what the reply is. It says, then shall you say to them, because your fathers have forsaken me, Yahweh, and forsaken Yahweh, and walked after other gods, and served them, and have worshipped them, and forsaken me, and kept not my law. So the answer that is given to them is the same answer that has been given from all time. And then Jeremiah goes on to say that of a second Exodus. And in verse 15 it says, let's go to verse 14. But behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that it shall no more be said, Yahweh lives who brought up the children out of the land of Egypt. But Yahweh lives who brought the children out of the land of the north and out of the lands whither he had driven them. And he shall bring them again to their own land that he gave to their fathers. So we see again this idea of this eternal covenant that is offered to each and every generation if they are willing. It doesn't end. It's like every time a generation arises where there is a possibility of them taking a hold of the covenant to obey it, Yahweh opens up and says, here's my covenant. But then, you have some generations like the Second Temple remnant. When you read through Ezra and Nehemiah's testimony, you find they did not sanctify the Sabbath. They oppressed one another. So instead, as Jeremiah points out, there's this unquenchable judgment that goes forth because they forsook the covenant. And we find this idea, too, of hiding of the face. This time in Israel's history where Yahweh would hide his face, as stated in Deuteronomy 32. He says, I will see what their end will be because they are a faithless people. The prophets acknowledged this time and this hiding of the face in all of their testimonies, this time right before the latter-day restoration. And this is what Jeremiah again says, and this is going to be Jeremiah 30, verse 18. It says, for thus says Yahweh, behold, I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents and have mercy on his dwelling places. And the city shall be builded upon her own heap, and the palace shall remain after the manner thereof. And out of them shall proceed thanksgiving in the voice of them that makes mercy and makes merry. And I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will glorify them, and they shall not be small. Their children shall be as before time, and their congregations shall be established before me. I will punish all those that oppress them. Notice this is talking about a establishment of an older way, a reestablishment of this self-government, a reestablishment of this independence that the nation once knew and that the nation has since lost. And in Jeremiah 31, he says, and at the same time Yahweh says, will I be the God of all the families of Israel, and they will be my people. So this again is a fulfilling of the circumcision covenant. And we find that again, that Yahweh brings Israel back into the land. And go down to verse 8. He says, behold, I will bring them for the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them and bind up the lame and the woman with child and her that travails with child together. A great company shall return here. And they shall come with weeping and with supplication, and I will lead them, and cause them to walk by the rivers of water in a straight way, wherein they will not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Now, what makes Ephraim Yahweh's firstborn? We find in Exodus 4:22 that Israel is Yahweh's firstborn. Israel is Yahweh's firstborn because Israel is the first nation of all nations to return to Yahweh and to sanctify his covenant and to walk in his ways. But Israel is only the first nation. As other nations sees Israel's blessings, they see that this way of wisdom that works and makes them so strong and righteous and extinguishes disease, then Israel prevails in the way other nations will want it. But we find that of the 12 tribes of Israel, Ephraim is the firstborn. Ephraim is the first of all nations to sanctify this way. And, for us today, this, at the first Exodus, we see that Israel was worshiping false gods, that the nation had been taken over by foreigners. They were on the brink of war, and that there was this arrogant king. But at the same time, all of these things happened to allow Yahweh's name to be made known, to be made throughout the earth. And today, Yahweh hasn't changed. He is still there wanting to be our God, wanting us to circumcise not only our flesh, but our hearts to him. For 3,500 years, his covenant has been there, ready for us to take hold. That's right. 3,003. What did we say?
I think we said 3,563
yeah,
years.
3,563 years, exactly, waiting for us to return to him. I mean, if that isn't a patient God, what else is a patient God that waits over 3,000 years for you to be a people to him? But the stipulations and the qualifications haven't changed. We still have to take of that self-replicating oath. We still have to take of that Passover sacrifice to eat it and to say, yes, I will be held accountable, but also to prevail in the way, to live by the philosophical way of life that Yahovah has given to us. And it is in this wrestling in the way, in taking hold of it and not letting go, that allows us to prevail in the way of Yahweh. Isaiah talks of a time when he says, you will say in this day, lo, this is our God, we have waited for him, and he will save us. This is Yahweh, we had waited for him, and we will be glad and rejoice in his salvation. This salvation occurs through prevailing in his way, by taking hold of it and not letting go. Isaiah, let me give you one last verse here before we go. This is Isaiah 62, verse 7. He says, and this is spoken to the latter-day remnant of Israel. He says, I have set watchmen on your walls, O Jerusalem, which shall never hold their peace day or night, that shall mention the name of Yahweh and keep not silence. Behold, give him no rest, this is speaking to Yahweh, until he establish and until he make Jerusalem a praise in the earth. And this is really our commission today. Take hold of the covenant. Obey it. Give Yahweh no peace. Give him no rest day or night until he establishes his covenant, until he fulfills his word to us. Yahweh holds us accountable. Hold Yahweh accountable to establish his covenant with us and to make us a people to him again. Shabbat Shalom.